French Influence on English by Betty, Jan, Sophia, and Mary. Introduction. When William of Normandy conquered England in 1066, it led to the creation of the English language we know today. English has changed a lot from how it was spoken 1,000 years ago. The English language has changed a lot because of the huge French influence. French was language spoken by the aristocracy and what was used in most official documents for the next 300 years. English survived because it was the language spoken by the peasants, and they began to include French words spoken by the aristocracy and some Latin words that are spoken by the church in their dialogue. In the 1300s, the aristocracy and government adopted English. English has changed a lot from what had previously been spoken 300 years ago. Historical background. In the 6th century, the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes conquered England. Around 300 years later, the king at the time died with no direct heir. Harold Godwinson became the new king of England. William of Normandy, a French duke, saw this as unfair because he claimed that he had been promised the throne. So when Harold was fighting Vikings in the north, William saw this as his opportunity to invade England and take over the throne. He succeeded, and in 1066, William of Normandy became the new king of England. The people that lived in England at the time spoke Old English, also known as Anglo-Saxon. William did not learn the language, so the language spoken by the king and his court was French. French became the language of the aristocracy for the next 300 years. When William became king, he installed the feudal system of governing, much like the French one. He removed the previous lords and gave their land to French lords. He also made them swear an oath of loyalty to him. An example that we can see today of the French influence on the English language are words like dine and eat. Dine, a French word, although not actually fancier, sounds more formal than eat, a traditionally English word. This is because words like dine were words that the aristocracy who spoke French used, and they sounded more formal to the peasants.
A large portion of the English dictionary comes from French. This was a result of the Norman invasion. The Norman invasion changed the English way of life, so the English needed to have new words to reflect that change. English mostly borrowed these words from French, since borrowing is much easier than stealing. The words English borrowed from the French were not chosen randomly. For instance, many of the words the English borrowed from the French were words for high living and fashion, such as mansion, money, and gown. The rulers of England during this time were often Norman French, and as a result, the words for nobility, such as crown and prince, and matters pertaining to the government, such as court and judge, were often French as well. Other words relating to the military and the church were often borrowed from French, since the French were the ones who were more involved with these matters. The English word for money comes from the Old French word monnaie, which comes from the Latin moneta, which means mint or money. It was originally a title for the goddess Juno, and there was a temple which was for the goddess Juno, which was where money used to be minted. The words the English borrowed from the Norman French often reflected the fact that the people who spoke French in England were often the upper class. The borrowing of French words helped English make a distinction between words used for the animals in the field and the food. For example, take the two words pork and swine. Today, pork refers to the meat we eat, and swine refers to the living animal, and often comes with a negative connotation. This was a result of the English word pork comes from the Old French porc, which comes from the Latin porcus, which meant pig. The French-speaking nobles were the ones who ate pork, and thus the word for pig. In comparison, the English word swine came from the Old English word swin, which has Germanic origins. The Anglo-Saxon peasants who worked with the actual living pigs usually spoke English, and as a result, swine refers to a pig. Other examples of French and Anglo-Saxon near synonym pairs other than pork and swine are infant to child, amity to friendship, aid to help, and maternity to motherhood. So what's the difference between these synonym pairs? Take the words aid and help. You could say help me in daily life, but would you use aid me? Aid sounds more formal and fancy. Words the English borrowed from the Norman French end up with a more fashionable or fancy connotation, since the Normans who occupied England were often nobles and members of the higher class.
English vocabulary and pronunciation were influenced by the Norman French. However, English grammar were influenced by the Vikings more. A change in the language is corresponded to how two languages interact with each other. Under the rule of the Norman French, English was spoken by those of the lower class and who were not educated, while Norman French was spoken by those higher in the hierarchy. The Norman society were ruled by the French-speaking nobles and not much interaction between the peasant and the nobles. Many nobles do learn the English language as a second language, but their interaction with the peasant was still limited, which also limited their influence on the English language. However, it still influenced the vocabulary and the pronunciation. Many words that was adopted from Norman French were used to describe more finer aspect of life. The Viking influence was different from the Norman French because of the different relationship with the English language. The Viking integrated themselves into the English culture and settled down and lived with the population and lived together with the peasants, as opposed to ruling over them like the Norman French did. Because of the origin of the Viking were from a Germanic origin, the Vikings were able to easily integrate themselves into the English community, which helped the language interaction and was able to influence more than just vocabulary in English. It was able to influence English vocabulary, pronunciation, and grammar structure. The Viking influenced their vocabulary and phonetic from all aspects of life, such as changing A to egg. The sound of G were attached to into the word egg, and the sound was carried over into the English language. Similar thing happened to the sound of K and sk. This situation was similar to the Norman French. However, because of the closer and more intimate contact between English and Viking, the English borrowed some of the Vikings' grammatical structure. Examples of the adopted grammatical structure are pronouns and the verb form. Third person plural pronoun were also of Vikings' origin, such as they, them, and their, are all from the Viking origin. Norman French, however, only influenced the vocabulary of English, also phonetics. An example of such is eating and dining. Dining is used to describe a proper meal, a finer meal, while eating is just used to describe ingest food items.
Even though French became the language of the aristocracy and held much cultural prestige upon years, for years, English managed to survive against the odds and eventually make a comeback around the 13th century. There are several reasons for why it continued to thrive. One being that English remained as the language of the common folk for centuries. Though there was no standard dialect of English among the people for a very long time, rather than a bunch of different ones for people of various areas to communicate, it was still very well established to the point where several centuries would have been needed to eradicate it. English didn't just survive through the common people at the time. Many members of the group of invading Normans learned the language as well, though they were mainly French-speaking. Many Normans began to intermarry soon after conquering the area and in turn would have to learn some of their partner's language, which was often English. Their children were taught a mix of both English and French from early on, successfully continuing to preserve the language. However, one of the most prominent reasons for English's survival was the conflict between France's king, King John, and many Norman noblemen in 1204. King John declared that, in short, people could only be in either France or England and couldn't own land in both. Many Norman men lost their land back in France, which was a step in the right direction for English, seeing as it severed ties between both France and England. Spoken-wise, English most likely began to emerge again as a language in 1204 as tensions between the King of France and many Normans soared. With ties between France and England severed, a certain Englishman pride began to sweep through the people, causing them to speak more and more English. By the 13th century, French was only used by the higher elite for appearance's sake, and it was taught in schools rather than at home, like it had been previously. English was taught to children in a home setting by their parents, making it more of a natural language. French, on the other hand, became more of an acquired language instead. By 1362 CE, English was declared as the official language spoken by the courts by the Statute of the Pleading. This was one of the main things that cemented it as the official language to be used by Englishmen, along with the 100 Years' War, which created a series of conflicts between England and France that didn't end until the 14th century. Many Englishmen became convinced that King John was trying to destroy their language, which in turn made them even more likely to use it, if only to declare their independence from France. This was also the time of the Black Death, a plague responsible for the deaths of thousands of people, which broke out among the people and helped the rise of the peasants, seeing as there was a huge need for cheap labor that only they could fill in a short amount of time. The peasants only spoke variations of English, however, not French, lowering the once prestigious languages class even more. However, there is practically no evidence of English writing until the early 13th century, even though English was most likely spoken near 1204 after the conflicts between England and France. Because of this, we now know for certain that the integration of one language into another is not an instant process. The rise of English was gradual, because it was pitted against the languages French and even Latin. French had been the established language of the aristocracy for a century now, and Latin was currently the major language for education and religious purposes. English was spoken at the time, but it did not show up in writing until the 13th century, after those two languages mentioned before began to die out.
As a result of the Norman French invasion, French had a significant influence on English. French helped English come into its own as a language by enlarging the English dictionary and creating more complex and nuanced words. The words that English borrowed from French are not chosen randomly as well. English borrowed words from French that English did not already have, or words that sounded more fashionable. English persevered throughout the Norman invasion, and soon Middle English emerged. Today, many of the French words English borrowed are still in use. These borrowed French words have seeped into our vocabulary to the extent that you wouldn't realize these words were originally French. Now, English is a widely spoken language.
I know that